Incredible. Through extensive research, I've discovered that if the American government is good at one thing, it's cracking heads when people exercise their civil rights. Just make them all shut up. But the irony is, for every seemingly successful suppression, the history books almost always record a subsequent, long overdue reform. American history is filled with such moments of battle. The federal intervention in Los Angeles. This first story is one that's still unfolding. A crisis in Los Angeles prompted the federal government to take an action that looked less like peacekeeping and more like an invasion of California. And for every suppression, the history books almost always record a subsequent, long overdue reform bill. The crisis started as a protest against a federal immigration crackdown. Aggressive raids by federal ICE agents near schools and during graduation ceremonies led to what community members called the cruel disappearance of people. The public response was swift. Peaceful assemblies gathered at City Hall. But the anger quickly boiled over. Protesters blocked major freeways, set autonomous cars on fire, and began throwing Molotov cocktails, scooters, stones, and concrete blocks at police and vehicles. The Los Angeles Police Department declared a zero-tolerance policy for criminal activity, deploying tear gas and firing over 600 less lethal munitions into the crowds. The federal government's response to this escalating crisis was unprecedented. President Trump ordered in the U.S. Marines and federalized the state's National Guard for the first time in 60 years against the direct and furious objections of the state's own governor. Initially, 700 Marines and 2,000 Guardsmen were deployed, with another 2,000 authorized to follow. The official justification from the Secretary of Defense was the increased threat to federal law enforcement officers and federal buildings. California's Governor Newsom called the deployment an illegal takeover and an abuse of power, suggesting it was more about staging a political parade for a dangerous president than about public safety. Mayor Karen Bass also fiercely opposed the move. The LAPD chief stated he received no formal notice the Marines were on their way, which created significant logistical and operational challenges. This entire affair was seen by critics as a real-world test run for Project 2025, a controversial plan to reshape government and consolidate executive power. The result was a crisis on two fronts: protesters clashing with police on the streets, while the state of California was simultaneously suing the federal government in the courts. The Los Angeles riots and a military miscalculation. 33 years earlier, Los Angeles had experienced a different kind of chaos during the 1992 riots. The trigger was the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers in the videotaped beating of Rodney King. This verdict, combined with existing racial tensions, including the recent killing of a young girl named Latasha Harlins, caused the city to explode. For 4 to 5 days, the city was consumed by a spontaneous outburst of anger, leading to widespread rioting, looting, arson, and assaults. The final toll was staggering: 63 people dead, over 2,300 injured, more than 12,000 arrested, and over $1 billion in property damage. The initial LAPD response was widely criticized as slow and inadequate. The situation deteriorated so badly that the military was called in to help restore order. This force included thousands of California National Guardsmen and about 4,000 federal troops from the U.S. Army and Marines. However, introducing combat troops into a domestic crisis came with its own dangers. According to a later analysis, one simple misunderstanding of a cover me command led to U.S. Marines firing over 200 rounds of live ammunition in the middle of the chaos. The riots eventually ended, leading to the resignation of LAPD Chief Daryl Gates and the formation of multiple commissions to investigate the response and recommend police reforms. The police riot of Chicago. In 1968, the city of Chicago became the stage for a different kind of confrontation. With national sentiment against the Vietnam War at a fever pitch, about 10,000 protesters descended on the Democratic National Convention. Their tactics ranged from planned marches organized by groups like MOB to provocative street theater from the Yippies, who famously nominated a pig for president. The city's response, led by Mayor Richard Daley, who was determined to maintain order, was overwhelming. A force of up to 23,000 police officers, nearly 6,000 National Guardsmen, and another 6,000 active duty US Army soldiers was assembled to meet the protesters. This created a better than 2-to-1 ratio of armed officers to demonstrators. What followed was not a protest, but what a federal investigation, the Walker Report, later officially labeled a police riot, with the whole world watching on live television, as protesters chanted, "The whole world is watching." Police engaged in what the report called widespread, indiscriminate violence. They used batons and tear gas on protesters, reporters and bystanders alike, with the violence even spilling onto the convention floor itself. The spectacle damaged the Democratic Party, contributed to Richard Nixon's victory on a law and order platform, and resulted in the infamous Chicago 7 trial. The political aftershock of Proposition 8. Sometimes the most profound impact of a protest is not immediate, but unfolds over years. This was the case with the 1994 protests against California's proposition. The proposition, fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment during an economic recession, sought to deny public services like education and non-emergency health care to undocumented immigrants. In response, massive and largely peaceful protests erupted across the state. One march in Los Angeles drew an estimated 70,000 people, and over 10,000 students walked out of their schools to join the demonstrations. A key feature of the protests was the prominent display of Mexican flags by many demonstrators. In the short term, this backfired. Critics seized upon the imagery to reframe the debate from a matter of human rights to a question of national loyalty, a dynamic that mirrored concerns from the protest. This narrative shift helped Proposition 18-7 pass at the ballot box. It seemed like a decisive defeat for the protesters. However, the victory was short-lived. The courts eventually struck down most of the law, ruling that immigration policy is a federal, not a state, matter. But the true, long-term consequence was political. The fight against Proposition 18-7 is now widely credited with catalyzing a massive increase in Latino voter registration and political participation, which permanently altered California's political landscape and turning it into a solidly democratic state for generations to come. It was a political victory born from a tactical defeat.